advance. I will be your friend. For a space, both men were silent, turning over in their minds the wonderful changes that this dramatic reconciliation would bring about. In the cold, gloomy forest, with the wind tearing in fitful gusts through the naked branches and whistling around the tree trunks, they lay and waited for the help that would now bring release and succor to both parties. And each prayed a private prayer that his men might be the first to arrive, so that he might be the first to show honorable attention to the enemy that had become a friend. Presently, as the wind dropped for a moment, Ulrich broke silence. "Let's shout for help," he said. "In this lull, our voices may carry a little way." "They won't carry far through the trees and undergrowth," said Georg. "But we can try. Together, then." The two raised their voices in a prolonged hunting call. "Together again," said Ulrich a few minutes later, after listening in vain for an answering hello. "I heard something that time, I think," said Ulrich. "I heard nothing but the pestilential wind," said Georg hoarsely. There was silence again for some minutes, and then Georg gave a joyful cry. "I can see figures coming through the wood. They are following in the way I came down the hillside." Both men raised their voices in as loud a shout as they could muster. "They hear us! They've stopped! Now they see us! They're running down the hill toward us!" cried Ulrich. "How many of them are there?" asked Georg. "I can't see distinctly," said Ulrich. 9 or 10. "Then they are yours," said Georg. "I had only 7 out with me." "They are making all the speed they can. Brave lads," said Ulrich gladly. "Are they your men?" asked Georg. "Are they your men?" he repeated impatiently, as Ulrich did not answer. "No," said Ulrich with a laugh, the idiotic, chattering laugh of a man unstrung with hideous fear. "Who are they?" asked Georg quickly, straining his eyes to see what the other would gladly not have seen. "Wolves."
All right, so one of the things that makes Saki the writer that he is, and many have pointed out, he is truly one of the greatest of short fiction writers, are his endings. We'll study other texts like The Open Window, which plays the exact same game. But probably no short story of Saki's is more famous than The Interlopers. Now, I predicted for you that we would begin with this title because you got to know what the word means. So if you've looked at it, it's one of our vocab words. Interloper means coming in between or interrupting in some way. So jot down really quickly, why is this story called The Interlopers? All right. And I also predicted for you that we would pay some attention to the whole notion of conflict. Now, this may shock you a little bit, but the place that I'm actually going to go to begin this story is actually going to be to the most famous story of all time. I know some of you already at 3A have written down Most Dangerous Game as obvious comparisons. I mean, it makes sense with Rainsforth and Zaroff, those two who are going at each other. Yes? And of course, some of you will jot down at 3A already the Hatfields and McCoys because you're familiar with the whole notion in American history of the idea of feuds. And when we study, of course, Romeo and Juliet, the Capulets and the Montagues will be rooted, that whole story will be rooted in the notion of two families that hate each other's guts. But the place I'm going to go is for Saki where the story actually begins. In the history of stories, there is none greater than the story of Homer's Iliad. We are fighting at the walls of Troy. And we at the walls of Troy finally will come face to face, the two greatest heroes. On the one hand, we have the great Achilles of the Greeks. Now, Achilles hasn't been fighting in the war. He and his best friend Patroclus, they set out of the war because Achilles got his pride injured. He felt like there was not a fair treatment for him, and he and his pal Patroclus sat in their tent, watching the Trojans who came out of that amazing city, fighting, especially led by the great Hector. Hector gets all the way down by the Greek troops and their ships. He's ready to end this contest. It's going to be over. Patroclus will say to his best friend Achilles, "Let me fight in your armor." And, sure enough, wearing Achilles' armor, Patroclus will come out of the tent. The Greeks think that Achilles has returned. They all say, hurrah. The Trojans think that Achilles has returned. They all say, oh boy. And they turn and start running towards Troy, except for the great warrior Hector, who says, a man's got to die sooner or later. He might as well die fighting the greatest fighter of them all, Achilles. And he goes face to face. It takes him no time to kill Achilles. But when he takes the helmet off, he realizes it's not Achilles. And in his rage, he takes off the armor of Achilles. He puts it on himself. He does nasties to the body of Patroclus, setting up the ultimate contest the next day between Achilles and Hector. Because when Patroclus comes back dead, Achilles says, that man will pay. And you have that famous scene outside the walls of the city of Troy. Hector standing face to face with the greatest warrior of all time, Achilles. And Hector is the first one to speak, and he will say it. Okay, so here's the deal, man. When we fight, whoever is the winner is going to give the body back of the defeated guy, the dead guy, to the city. So, for example, if I kill you, I'll give your body back to the Greeks. If you kill me, you give my body back to the Trojans. And it's Achilles who says, there is no way that you and I will ever be able to be together. In the same way that a lion has no interest in being with a lamb, the last thing you're going to see is my boot coming down right in your eye socket. I'm going to jack you and jack you good. It will, of course, then turn into kind of almost a moment of comedy. Hector will turn and start running around the city of Troy to get away from Achilles. And finally, of course, they will fight. Now, why is that story such an important story? Because that story is the backdrop for what really is going to happen in our story. You're going to have two guys who loathe each other. They hate each other. They're part of a feud, a family feud. They've always hated each other, and they, of course, are going to come face to face. Let's work at level 1 now through the story. I was starting on page 271. Notice we are in the woods. The Carpathians is this incredible forest with all these trees. Notice, interestingly, but the game for whose presence he kept so keen an outlook was none that figured in the sportsman's calendar. Ehrlich will be our first one introduced. Notice the use of the word game immediately makes us think of Most Dangerous Game. And the way that word can get used two different ways. Game as in something you play at, game as in something you hunt. The human enemy at the bottom of page 271. Of course, let's go to 272 now and continue. We've got a 3-generational feud. Jot down in your notes, what is a feud? Write that one down really quickly. What is a feud? It's not just a fight, is it? A feud is when you have two parties that generationally hate each other's guts, right? So we've got Ehrlich versus Georg. There's been debates all their life about who owns what land. They hate each other. We've got the winter night. The setting, of course, is disturbing. You've got the disturbing element in the forest. And then the key on page 272. Ehrlich is going to stray away by himself from the Watchers, which allows for the first of possible interlopers. Of course, all of a sudden, face to face. We immediately think of that moment in Most Dangerous Game, right? When Zaroff and Rainsford come face to face, and there they are, ready to kill each other. You are at the moment in the Iliad when you have the two greatest fighters who hate each other's guts, ready to kill each other. And then, of course, we'll begin to think about conflict. Think about that. When the two of them are together face to face, what conflict would you qualify that as? Clearly, right? Man versus man, in this case, character versus character, right? They are ready to face off. Face to face, they're ready to go. They have hate in their heart. They have murder in their heart. They're ready to go. And then, no word spoken, but a deed of nature's own violence overwhelmed them both. You can see why freshmen will be encouraged to read the stories like Most Dangerous Game and, of course, Interlopers here, because we also have the second conflict, right, of character versus nature. Note the irony. That right at the moment when they're ready to face off, you have nature that intervenes in the most bizarre of ways. A huge birch tree falling down on both of them, trapping both of them so that now they're both pinioned, which means trapped, right? Notice 273, relief at last lines. Relief at being alive, exasperation at his captive plight, right, being trapped, brought a strange medley of pious thank offerings, thank heavens I'm not dead, and sharp curses to Ehrlich's lips. Then you have the snarling laugh, and now you have the exchange. Let's write this down. The next interesting conflict is going to be represented, character versus character, by the argument, which will as well remind us of the opening lines of the Iliad when you will have Agamemnon going at it with Achilles. The reason why Achilles will stay in his tent and not fight through much of the Iliad is because he and Agamemnon get in a fight. This time it's over a different kind of possession, not land, but a woman, okay? And so this will lead to Achilles deciding to step out. Notice how the exchange, right, is nasty from the very beginning. Notice there's real justice for you. Let's write that one down on page 274 in that first full paragraph. There's real justice for you. This is a story about justice. Right? So let's write that down. This is a story about justice. In other words, you get what you deserve, if you will. Okay? In other words, ha! I caught you. You were poaching on my land. What are you talking about? That's not your land. This is my land. Right? And we start to have this exchange. And then you, of course, have this thing about, you know what? I'm going to make sure that when my men find you that we're going to kill you, but then I'll make sure that I at least send condolences to your family. Well, you know what? If my friends show up first, I'm going to kill you, only I'm not sending any condolences to your family. By the way, let's just point out, this almost looks as silly as two schoolboys on a playground ready to fight. Right? Of course, what is our central question of Unit 2? Is conflict necessary? Why is it the case in the history of the world that people will go to war? The Iliad will say it. It's because of a lack of conflict resolution. We don't know how to resolve conflict, and the only way we can resolve conflict is to start insulting each other, and then, of course, ultimately, to kill each other, right? But, notice we have some irony on page 274 and 275. Good, snarled Georg, good. We fight this quarrel out to the death, you and I, and our foresters, with no cursed interlopers to come between us. Death and damnation to you. Whoa, no interlopers, meaning, of course, nobody's going to interrupt. Nobody's going to get in our way. The irony, of course, of the use of this is remarkable, given what we're about to hear is going to happen at the end of our story. Then, something kind of fascinating starts to happen. We've got an interesting moment on page 275. Both men spoke with the bitterness of possible defeat before them, for each knew that it might be long before his men would seek him out or find him. It was a bare matter of chance which party would arrive first on the scene. Now, the reason why we do close reading of a text is so I can begin to show you the genius of a writer. Watch this. I want to introduce for you now the philosophic question of determinism. Write it down in your notes. This is the question of determinism. Now, in philosophy, what exactly does that mean? It means this. It is a question of whether you believe in something called fate, that is to say, all things are predetermined, or whether you believe in something called chance, and it's kind of random in the universe. Do you got me? So this debate is, do you believe in the notion of fate, determinism? Everything has been planned out in some way. Or rather, do you believe in the idea that everything is about random chance and there is no determinism or fate in the universe? The classic example of this is to imagine a talking baseball who gets thrown through the air and the baseball says out loud, "I am so happy today that I chose to take a flight." Think about that. I am so happy today. I woke up this morning and said, I am going to take a flight, and that's why I'm flying through the air. Of course, you would say to the baseball, no, you didn't choose anything about flying through the air. Rather, it chose you. So watch this question. Did you choose the two people who hooked up and exchanged fluids to produce you? Did you choose the language that was spoken at your birth and your hearing for the first time, and then the language that you were taught as you grew up? Did you choose anything in the first year of your life at all? Or was it rather appropriated for you by other people? Can you write down one thing on your notes that you actually chose of your own free will in the first year of your life? Of course, those of you who have studied your DNA, you know all about the very fact that you're encoded with a DNA that seems to almost be like fate of a kind. You didn't choose the color of your eyes. Well, yeah, but sure, as I got older, I at least chose things of my own free volition. Dude, I could get up right now and walk out of 303 if I wanted to. That would be a choice, would it? Would it? Because it seems to me that even your decision to get up and walk out of this room is of itself somehow determined around certain kind of rules. Why are you here in the first place? What of your life is chosen freely? What of your life is predetermined? This story, of course, is going to play that game, right? The assumption is we're out looking for each other in the woods, we're ready to kill each other, and then all of a sudden, the first interloper, a big tree. Is it predetermined? Is it fated? And more particularly, write this one down, what are we supposed to learn from an experience like this? Well, the learning takes place, interestingly, through a wine flask, right? So, man, I'm thirsty. You know what? I need a drink. I'm going to get a drink. You know what? I should probably share a little bit of drink, wine, with my enemy. And he makes the overture, right? Let us drink, last line of 275, even if tonight one of us dies. The response is, I don't drink wine with an enemy. Page 276 at the top. And then all of a sudden, an idea slowly forming in the mind of Ehrlich, right? That is to say, hatred seemed to be dying down. And he says it. I've changed my mind. If my men find me, the first thing I'll do is to tell them to free you. Let's go ahead and not worry about this, notice it, stupid strip of forest where the trees can't even stand upright in a breath of wind. He says it, we've been fools. Now this begs a really interesting question. Do you buy this change of heart? Do you believe that in a moment of life and death, somebody can change so quickly a position that goes from hate to a decision about friendship? Do you buy it? Or are you rather inclined, the skeptics in the house, to say, Ehrlich's playing an interesting game here. He's saying, hey, let's be friends. So, in other words, if Georg's group shows up first, Georg will say, yeah, friends. And that will allow for Ehrlich to make sure that he doesn't get jacked. On the other hand, if his guys show up first, he'll be able to kill Georg right away. No problem. Is that what's going on here? In other words, put it in your notes this way. I told you, great writers always learn to make us ask good questions. This is the question. Do you buy the notion that Ehrlich is actually able to change so quickly his mind? Do feuds end so quickly? In other words, do you think conflict resolution changes when both parties recognize their own potential annihilation? I'll ask the question again. Do you think that both parties will resolve conflict differently, more honestly, when they both recognize the potentiality of their own annihilation, their own death, their own ending, if you will? Georg himself starts to think about this. And he says it out loud. You know what? If we showed up at the mall together, people would be like, no way. Worst of enemies. Family enemies. Can you imagine if we were to bury the hatchet and actually show up together? No interlopers, he said, from the outside would ever interfere. The second use of the word in the story. Obviously, the irony is building. Let's point out at the top of 277, we're talking now about harmony. That's what it's all about. In other words, what would it be like to go from hating each other and fighting all the time to being harmonious? Let's just jump to 3b really quickly and point out, you've probably heard of the idea that sometimes your best friend started out as your worst enemy. How many times in the history of relationships has this happened, right? Where the person you like the most started out, ooh, man, I hate that guy. And then all of a sudden ended up pals. Here we're playing the game of harmony. And they decide, you know what, let's make peace. I will be your friend, Georg says. And they're both kind of silent for a while. However, each prayed a private prayer. I'm on page 277. Read it with me. First full paragraph. Each prayed that his men might be the first to arrive, so that he might be the first to show some honorable attention to the enemy that had become a friend. Do you buy it? Or was the other one, each one praying, man, I hope my guys show up first, because then I can always renege on my decision here. Then, of course, let's shout for help. What's the irony? Write it in your notes. What's the irony of shouting for help? They're calling for help to their, of course, pals. But what, of course, has better hearing than any human? Who shows up at the end of the story? Wolves, you got it. So note the irony. The minute they start shouting for help, they're saying to the wolves, hey, hey, free food here. The buffet is over here under a tree. The irony, right? However, notice that the word together gets used twice. Notice the irony. They start out enemies. They come together under a tree. And they become friends of a kind together, shouting for help.